The classified cable landed on the desk of Soviet Air Defense Command headquarters on a frozen Moscow morning in the late 1970s, its contents so alarming that 3 separate intelligence officers had flagged it with red stamps before it reached the general's hands. American spies had been caught photographing something at McDonnell Douglas facilities in St. Louis, and what they'd seen would fundamentally challenge everything the Soviet Union believed about air combat superiority. The photographs showed an aircraft unlike anything in the skies, sleek and purposeful, equipped with a radar system that intelligence analysts claimed could detect and track targets at ranges that defied the known laws of engagement. Soviet military leadership read the reports with deep skepticism, their confidence bolstered by years of investment in interceptor technology and the belief that their MiG fighters represented the cutting edge of aerial warfare. The numbers in the intelligence briefing seemed impossible, the claimed detection ranges so extraordinary that senior officers dismissed them as either measurement errors or deliberate American disinformation designed to provoke wasteful Soviet spending. Yet the photographs kept coming, and with them grew an uncomfortable question that no one in the Kremlin wanted to ask aloud. What if the Americans had achieved something genuinely revolutionary, something that would render Soviet tactics obsolete before a single shot was ever fired? The technological arms race had always been a game of incremental advantages, small improvements in speed or maneuverability that shifted the balance of power by mere percentages. But the reports flooding into Moscow spoke of something different entirely, a quantum leap that threatened to redefine the very nature of air-to-air combat in ways Soviet planners had never anticipated. In the classified briefing rooms beneath the Kremlin, maps were redrawn and tactical doctrines questioned as intelligence officers struggled to reconcile their institutional confidence with the mounting evidence of American innovation. The aircraft they called the Eagle was coming, and whether Soviet commanders believed in its capabilities or not, it would soon prove itself in the unforgiving theater of aerial combat. The only question remaining was how many pilots would pay the ultimate price before Moscow accepted the truth that their technological supremacy had been shattered by an enemy they had underestimated. The elite Soviet pilots who gathered in the briefing rooms of Kubinka Air Base carried themselves with the unmistakable swagger of men who had mastered the science of killing at 40,000 feet, their leather jackets adorned with insignias that marked them as the best interceptor pilots the motherland had ever produced. These were not raw recruits fresh from training academies, but veterans who had spent thousands of hours in the cockpits of MiG-25s and MiG-23s, aircraft that could climb faster than rockets and reach speeds that turned the air itself into a furnace of compressed heat and friction. They had studied American tactics through countless simulations, analyzed every engagement from Vietnam to the Middle Eastern conflicts, and developed an institutional certainty that Soviet doctrine represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare philosophy. Their confidence was not mere bravado, but the product of a system that had poured unlimited resources into air defense, creating interceptors specifically designed to destroy American bombers before they could threaten Soviet cities with nuclear annihilation. The radar systems in their aircraft had proven reliable in exercises. Their missiles had demonstrated acceptable kill rates in testing, and their training had instilled an absolute belief in the superiority of coordinated ground-controlled interception tactics. When intelligence officers briefed them on the American F-15 Eagle, explaining the reported capabilities of its radar and weapons systems, the pilots exchanged skeptical glances and suppressed knowing smiles. To them, the claims sounded like the desperate exaggerations of a nation whose previous fighters had proven disappointingly vulnerable in actual combat conditions. Major Yevgeny Volkov, a decorated interceptor pilot with 17 years of service and eyes that had witnessed the curvature of Earth from altitudes where the sky turns black, stood before his squadron and delivered the assessment that most of his comrades shared in their hearts. The Americans build beautiful aircraft that photograph well for their propaganda magazines, but when metal meets metal in actual combat, it is training and doctrine that determine the victor, not fancy electronics that probably fail in the first moments of real stress, he declared, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of experience. His fellow pilots nodded in agreement, having seen Western equipment captured in proxy wars, examined in Soviet laboratories, and often found wanting when stripped of its marketing mythology. They understood that beyond visual range combat was largely theoretical, that real engagements, typically, devolved into turning fights where pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability determined survival, and that Soviet tactics had been refined through decades of careful study and practical application. The notion that an American radar could somehow track multiple targets at impossible distances while simultaneously guiding missiles to their destinations seemed to violate everything they understood about the limitations of airborne electronics and the physics of detection. What they failed to grasp in those confident briefing sessions was that technological revolutions do not announce themselves politely or wait for acceptance, and that the gap between what they believed possible and what American engineers had achieved would be measured not in percentages, but in the lives of pilots who would die still disbelieving. The training exercises that Soviet pilots conducted in preparation for potential confrontations with Western aircraft reinforced their tactical confidence and deepened their conviction that ground-controlled, interception supported by extensive radar networks represented warfare's future, rather than the individualistic approach favored by American doctrine. They practiced coordinated attacks where multiple aircraft would converge on targets from different vectors, overwhelming defensive systems through sheer numerical advantage and tactical sophistication that relied on centralized command directing every movement like pieces on a chessboard. Their instructors, many of whom had flown combat missions in various conflicts under Soviet advisement, emphasized that American pilots were trained for independence and individual initiative, qualities that Soviet doctrine viewed as vulnerabilities rather than strengths in the disciplined chaos of modern aerial warfare. The simulations always ended the same way, with Soviet interceptors successfully engaging and destroying their targets through superior coordination and the kind of tactical discipline that came from a military culture that valued collective action over personal glory. As they climbed into their cockpits and felt the familiar vibration of powerful engines roaring to life beneath them, these pilots genuinely believed they were prepared for anything the Americans might deploy against them. The tragedy of their confidence was not that it was entirely unfounded, but that it was built on assumptions about technological parity that had already been shattered in American laboratories and testing ranges, leaving them to fly into a future where the rules of engagement had been rewritten without their knowledge or consent. In the sterile corridors of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the classified hangars of Edwards, where test pilots pushed experimental aircraft beyond the boundaries of human endurance, American engineers confronted a problem that had haunted military planners since the first Soviet bomber appeared in reconnaissance photographs. The challenge was not simply building a faster fighter or mounting larger missiles, but creating an integrated weapons system that could detect, track, and destroy enemy aircraft before those targets even knew they were being hunted, fundamentally rewriting the calculus of aerial warfare through technology rather than tactics. The F-15 Eagle emerged from this crucible of Cold War competition as something unprecedented, a fighter designed around its radar system rather than the traditional approach of adding electronics to an airframe as an afterthought. What the Soviets dismissed as propaganda was actually the ANAPG-63 radar, a pulse Doppler system that could distinguish individual aircraft from ground clutter at distances that seemed impossible to pilots trained on previous generation equipment. Its computer processors analyzing returning signals with a sophistication that represented a genuine quantum leap in capability. Engineers had solved the fundamental problem that plagued earlier radars, the inability to separate low-flying targets from the ground's massive radar return, creating a look-down, shoot-down capability that transformed beyond visual range combat from theoretical possibility into practical reality. The development cost billions and required breakthroughs in materials science, computer miniaturization, and signal processing that pushed American technology to its absolute limits. But the result was an aircraft that didn't just exceed Soviet capabilities, but operated in an entirely different paradigm of warfare. Colonel Michael Hawk Patterson, who had flown 2 tours in Vietnam and understood intimately how American pilots died when their equipment failed them against determined enemies, approached the F-15 with the skepticism of a combat veteran who had buried too many friends. The first time, he sat in the cockpit at Nellis Air Force Base and powered up the radar system during an operational test. Watching the display populate with targets at ranges his instructor casually mentioned exceeded anything the Soviets could match, he experienced a moment of genuine disbelief that gave way to something approaching reverence. Gentlemen, if this machine performs in combat like it does in these exercises, we're not just ahead of the Soviets, we're fighting a different war entirely, he told his squadron during their first full briefing, his voice carrying none of its usual sardonic edge. The radar could track multiple targets simultaneously while the pilot maneuvered, could guide missiles to intercepts at distances where enemy aircraft appeared as mere specks against the horizon, and could do all this while maintaining situational awareness that transformed the chaotic confusion of aerial combat into something resembling a controlled chess match. American doctrine evolved rapidly around these capabilities, emphasizing the advantage of engaging enemies before they could employ their own weapons, maintaining distance and exploiting the technological superiority that Soviet pilots would mistake for impossible until the moment missiles began detonating around them. Training became less about dogfighting maneuvers and more about managing information, understanding the radar display as intimately as one's own heartbeat, and maintaining the discipline to kill efficiently from beyond visual range rather than closing for the traditional fighter pilot's engagement. The first operational F-15 squadrons deployed to Europe carried with them classified technical manuals that flight crews guarded more carefully than nuclear codes, understanding that the aircraft's true capability represented a strategic advantage that could shift the entire balance of Cold War deterrence if properly employed. Maintenance crews worked in secured facilities where even Allied personnel were restricted, protecting not just the radar technology, but the software algorithms and signal processing techniques that made the system function with such devastating effectiveness. NATO commanders began revising air defense plans based on the Eagle's capabilities, calculating engagement scenarios where small numbers of F-15s could decimate Soviet bomber formations before those aircraft reached their nuclear delivery points, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus that had dominated military planning for decades. The Soviet intelligence services knew something had changed, their agents reporting unusual activity and heightened security around American fighter bases, but the specifics remained frustratingly elusive despite their best efforts. Pilots who would eventually face the F-15 in combat continued their training in blissful ignorance, their briefings mentioning the new American fighter as merely another incremental improvement rather than the revolutionary system it actually represented. A fatal misunderstanding that would cost lives when theory finally collided with reality in the unforgiving mathematics of modern aerial warfare. The psychological impact of possessing such overwhelming technological advantage created a dangerous confidence among some American pilots. Though the most experienced instructors constantly reminded their students that superiority in equipment meant nothing if complacency replaced discipline and proper tactics. The Eagle gives you the first shot and probably the killing shot, but it doesn't make you invincible. It makes you responsible for using that advantage with precision and professionalism, warned one training commander whose grey hair testified to decades of service, spanning the evolution from gunfighter dogfights to radar-guided missile combat. Every sortie reinforced the reality that modern air warfare had become as much about managing complex systems as flying the aircraft, requiring pilots who could think in 3 dimensions while simultaneously interpreting radar displays, managing weapon systems, and maintaining communication with command elements, coordinating the broader tactical picture. The F-15 represented not just American engineering prowess, but a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two superpowers approached the problem of air superiority, with the United States betting on technological supremacy and individual pilot initiative versus the Soviet emphasis on numerical advantage and centralized control. When these competing philosophies finally met in actual combat, the results would shock not just Soviet military leadership, but intelligence analysts worldwide who had assumed rough parity between the superpowers' aerial capabilities, shattering assumptions that had shaped strategic thinking throughout the Cold War's dangerous decades. The Bering Sea stretched beneath them in shades of grey that merged with the overcast sky, creating that peculiar disorientation where horizon disappeared and Soviet captain Viktor Antonovich Volkov felt suspended in a colorless void that matched the tension coiling in his chest. His MiG-23 responded crisply to control inputs as he led his flight of 4 interceptors along the boundary of international airspace, the kind of routine patrol that had become almost monotonous after 5 years of these Cold War dances where aircraft postured and probed without ever crossing the invisible lines that separated peace from catastrophe. The radar warning receiver remained silent, except for the expected signatures of American early warning aircraft maintaining their distant vigil, electronic sentinels that both sides had learned to read as casually as weather reports. Volkov's wingman flew tight formation off his right quarter, close enough that he could see the younger pilot's oxygen mask and imagine the boredom behind it. Another day of Cold War theater where nothing ever actually happened. Despite the apocalyptic stakes, both nations pretended justified these expensive exercises in aerial intimidation. Ground control's periodic updates crackled through his headset with the practiced indifference of controllers who had watched these same patterns repeat for years. Soviet aircraft here, American reconnaissance there, everyone maintaining the careful choreography that prevented accidents from becoming incidents. The late afternoon sun broke through clouds briefly, casting dramatic shadows across his canopy before disappearing again into the perpetual twilight of northern latitudes, where darkness came early and stayed late. This was supposed to be another routine intercept, another chapter in the endless Cold War novel where nothing changed except the faces of pilots who flew the same missions their predecessors had flown a decade earlier. The first indication something had shifted came not from Volkov's own radar, but from ground controls. Sudden change in tone, the bored professionalism replaced by something sharper as the controller reported unidentified contacts approaching from the east at high speed and altitude. Volkov's pulse quickened despite years of training designed to suppress exactly that reaction, his right hand moving instinctively to weapons controls while his eyes scanned the empty sky ahead, where clouds formed towering columns that could hide entire squadrons. His radar showed nothing unusual. just the normal clutter of surface returns and weather interference that Soviet systems struggled to filter at long ranges, the familiar limitations he had learned to work around through experience and intuition, rather than technology. Maintain current heading, additional units being scrambled to your position. Ground control instructed with practiced calm that did not quite mask the underlying urgency Volkov's experienced ears detected immediately. The intelligence briefings had mentioned new American fighters deploying to forward bases, something called the Eagle that analysts claimed represented only incremental improvements over existing types. Nothing that would fundamentally alter the tactical balance that had remained stable for years. Volkov had dismissed those reports as the usual Western propaganda, inflating modest advances into revolutionary breakthroughs, the kind of psychological warfare both sides employed to maintain funding and justify budgets to politicians who understood nothing about actual combat. His confidence came from 500 hours in the MiG-23 and a kill marking from a brief border skirmish where he had demonstrated the superiority of Soviet training against lesser opponents. Experience that told him American pilots were competent but not exceptional, dangerous but not invincible. The revelation came with shocking suddenness when his radar warning receiver erupted in urgent tones that Volkov had heard only during training exercises, indicating his aircraft was being tracked by fire control radar from impossible distances where his own sensors showed absolutely nothing. His wingman's voice cut through the radio, with barely controlled panic reporting the same situation, all 4 aircraft simultaneously illuminated by targeting systems that physics and intelligence briefings insisted could not reach them at these ranges. Volkov's mind raced through possibilities: ground control's mistake, equipment malfunction, some new American electronic warfare technique designed to create false alarms and psychological pressure. Anything except the alternative that his briefings were catastrophically wrong about the Eagle's actual capabilities. Break formation, evasive maneuvers, descend to negate radar. Lock, he ordered, with the command voice that came from years of authority, even as his own hands pushed the MiG into a diving turn that pressed him into his seat with brutal force. The radar warning receiver continued its screaming alert, unchanged by his maneuvers, the tracking following him through the dive with mechanical precision that suggested computer control far beyond what Soviet systems could manage. His own radar remained frustratingly empty, showing nothing but weather returns and ground clutter, while something out there in the grey void was tracking him with casual ease, hunting him from distances that violated every assumption upon which his tactics and training were based. The comfortable confidence that had sustained him through years of Cold War patrols evaporated in seconds, replaced by the cold realization that he was fighting blind against an enemy who could see him perfectly, a predator circling prey that had suddenly discovered its place in a food chain it had never known existed. Ground controls transmissions became increasingly frantic as controllers realized their interceptors were being systematically targeted by contacts their own radars could barely detect, issuing contradictory orders that reflected their own confusion about what was happening in the empty sky above the Bering Sea. Volkov leveled out at lower altitude where terrain masking should have broken the radar lock, a fundamental tactic that had worked reliably for decades, but the warning receiver's tone never wavered as unseen systems continued tracking his every movement with inhuman precision. His fuel state was becoming critical from the aggressive maneuvering, another factor that whoever was out there undoubtedly understood and was exploiting, forcing him to choose between continuing evasion or beginning the vulnerable journey back to base. They are closer than our systems can detect them, using radar that penetrates our countermeasures, Volkov transmitted to his flight with the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth, speaking aloud the truth. That training and pride had prevented him from accepting until this moment. The younger pilot's responses carried confusion and fear, emotions Volkov shared but could not acknowledge, while maintaining the command presence that kept panic from becoming rout. Somewhere in that grey void, American pilots sat in their eagles watching radar displays that told them everything while revealing nothing to their targets, holding Soviet lives in their hands with technological superiority that rendered courage and skill almost irrelevant. The Cold War had suddenly become very hot despite no shots being fired, the psychological defeat complete even before any missiles launched, and Volkov understood with crystalline clarity that everything had changed in these terrifying minutes above a sea that cared nothing for the geopolitical games played out in the sky above its indifferent waves. The psychological rupture occurred not gradually, but with the sudden violence of a breaking dam when Volkov's number 3 pilot screamed something incoherent across the radio frequency before his transmission cut to static that spoke louder than any final words could have. The younger pilot had been there 30 seconds earlier, a blip on Volkov's situational display and a voice reporting fuel state and position, and now he was simply gone, as though erased from existence by an invisible hand that reached down from the colorless sky. No explosion visible through the clouds, no parachute blooming white against grey, nothing but absence where a man and machine had occupied space just heartbeats before, while Volkov's mind struggled to process the impossible speed of the engagement. His hands moved on controls with trained precision that operated independently of conscious thought, throwing the MiG into another violent turn that grayed his vision at the edges. But the radar warning receiver's tone had already changed to the higher pitch, indicating actual missile launch rather than mere tracking. The comfortable assumptions that had governed his entire career dissolved like morning. Frost under harsh sunlight, replaced by the primal terror of being hunted by something he could neither see nor effectively fight against, using tactics developed for an entirely different kind of warfare. Chaff, flares, all countermeasures now. Volkov transmitted with forced calm, while his own fingers activated the defensive systems that filled the air behind his aircraft with metallic strips and burning decoys. Technological prayers offered to gods of physics that might or might not deflect weapons already in flight. His remaining wingman responded immediately with textbook precision, but number 4's voice carried the edge of panic that training could suppress, but never completely eliminate when death approached on invisible wings. The clouds that had seemed merely atmospheric minutes earlier now felt like hostile territory, concealing threats from every direction, each shadow potentially hiding the eagle pilots who were systematically dismantling his flight with the casual efficiency of technicians rather than warriors. Volkov's fuel gauge demanded attention he could not spare, while his radar continued displaying nothing useful, expensive equipment reduced to expensive weight by the Americans' ability to see without being seen. Ground control's transmissions had devolved into near chaos as controllers realized they were coordinating a slaughter rather than an interception, their voices tight with the helplessness of men who could observe disaster but not prevent it. The ideological certainty that had sustained Soviet military doctrine faced annihilation more complete than any physical defeat. Technology rendering bravery and dedication into quaint relics of an era already passing into history. The second kill came with equally horrifying efficiency when number 4's aircraft simply tumbled out of formation, trailing flame and debris, the pilot never managing even the abbreviated scream that had marked his comrade's death. Volkov caught a glimpse of the stricken MiG through breaking clouds, spinning toward the Bering Sea in the peculiar, slow-motion tumble of catastrophic structural failure, while his mind catalogued details with the detached precision that sometimes accompanies overwhelming trauma. No parachute emerged from the falling wreckage, meaning his pilot was either dead or unconscious or pinned by G-forces against an ejection seat that had become a coffin rather than salvation in those final seconds of consciousness. His remaining wingman was transmitting continuously now, in violation of radio discipline, young voice breaking with questions that had no answers and prayers that would not be answered, while Volkov tried desperately to formulate some tactic or maneuver that might salvage something from this technological ambush. The Eagles remained invisible phantoms existing only as electronic signatures and falling comrades, American pilots whose faces he would never see conducting execution with the dispassionate efficiency of superior technology deployed against obsolete opponents. Volkov's finger hesitated over the ejection handle with the terrible knowledge that abandoning his aircraft meant abandoning his wingman to face alone what neither could survive together, warrior's pride warring against survival instinct in the seconds remaining before someone else made that decision for him. The missile's final approach lasted 3.7 seconds, according to the cockpit recorder, that would later be recovered from the Bering Sea floor. Though for Captain Dmitry Volkov, those seconds stretched into something resembling eternity, as his tactical display finally registered the incoming weapon with an urgent red symbol that appeared far too close for effective countermeasures. His hands responded with trained reflexes that bypassed conscious thought, pulling the MiG into a climbing spiral while dispensing the last of his defensive flares in a desperate pattern that painted the grey sky with brief stars of burning phosphorus, each one a small prayer to physics and fortune that went comprehensively unanswered. The AIM-7 Sparrow tracked through his evasive maneuvers with the patient certainty of mathematics made flesh, radar guidance updating continuously from the distant Eagle, whose pilot Volkov would never meet or see or know beyond this final technological intimacy. His wingman's voice filled the radio frequency with warnings that came too late to matter, while ground controllers transmitted instructions for maneuvers already attempted and found wanting against American engineering that had anticipated every defensive tactic Soviet doctrine could devise. The clouds broke momentarily to reveal empty sky in every direction, no contrails or glints of metal to indicate where death approached from, only the abstract certainty of instruments reporting his final seconds with dispassionate precision. Volkov's last conscious thought before impact carried neither poetry nor profundity, merely the simple recognition that everything he had believed about Soviet air superiority had been comprehensively wrong, a miscalculation measured in missing pilots and burning wreckage rather than diplomatic abstractions. The white flash that followed erased further reflection as the missile's proximity fuse detonated 30 feet from his cockpit, fragmenting warhead, transforming aircraft and pilot into debris that tumbled toward cold waters below. His wingman witnessed the fireball through breaking clouds and made the split-second decision that training fought against, but survival demanded, yanking the ejection handle with hands that shook despite years of conditioning meant to eliminate such human weakness under pressure. The canopy separated cleanly in a rush of freezing air that stole breath and consciousness for the crucial seconds of rocket motor ignition, launching him clear of the doomed MiG, while 400 knots of airspeed tried to tear limbs from body with forces that turned the world into grey tunnel vision. The parachute deployed automatically at prescribed altitude with mechanical reliability that cared nothing for the terror of its user, jerking him upright with violent deceleration that cracked ribs and drove air from lungs in an involuntary gasp that became a scream lost in wind noise. Below him, the Bering Sea waited with temperatures that granted perhaps 15 minutes of consciousness before hypothermia claimed whatever the Americans and their invisible eagles had left alive. Cold mathematics of survival, reducing Soviet training and ideological certainty to the simple animal struggle against freezing water. His radio transmitted automatically on emergency frequency while he descended through cloud layers that seemed endless, calling for rescue that might arrive in time or might not, depending on variables beyond his control or comprehension. The last thing he saw before entering the clouds was empty sky, where his formation leader had existed seconds earlier, absence more eloquent than any debris field could manage in communicating the totality of their tactical defeat. The American pilot who had fired both killing shots never saw either enemy aircraft disintegrate under his missile's impact, maintaining professional discipline that kept his radar focused forward for additional threats rather than dwelling on kills already achieved, according to engagement protocols that emphasized efficiency over spectacle. His weapons system operator marked both targets as destroyed in the mission log, with notations that would later become classified intelligence assessments. Dry language of military reporting that stripped all human dimension from the act of ending lives, at distances that prevented personal recognition of enemy pilots as men rather than merely targets. The Eagle turned onto a new heading, with the casual grace of superior engineering, engines responding to throttle inputs with power that Soviet designers had attempted to match, but never quite achieved despite decades of effort and resources diverted from civilian economy. Radio chatter between the American flight leader and his wingmen carried the professional tone of surgeons discussing successful procedures rather than warriors celebrating victory, technological advantage rendering the engagement into something closer to execution than combat between peers. They would return to base with gun cameras and mission data, proving the F-15's capabilities beyond any propaganda exaggeration, hardware justifying every dollar of development cost in the currency of enemy aircraft eliminated without friendly losses. Ground control at the Soviet airbase received the emergency beacon transmission from the ejected pilot, with immediate scramble of search and rescue helicopters, controllers now fighting against time and ocean temperature rather than American fighters whose mission had already concluded with clinical efficiency. The operations center descended into controlled chaos, as senior officers demanded explanations that surviving pilots could not adequately provide, words failing to capture the psychological impact of being systematically destroyed by enemies who remained invisible throughout the entire engagement. Radar operators reviewed their recordings with growing confusion at how completely the American aircraft had evaded detection despite theoretical capabilities that should have provided adequate warning and tracking for effective countermeasures. The gap between doctrine and reality yawned like an abyss that swallowed comfortable assumptions about Soviet technological parity, each missing pilot representing not just personal tragedy, but systemic failure of intelligence assessments that had guided military planning for years. Rescue coordinators worked their radios with desperate efficiency while calculating survival probabilities that decreased with each passing minute, hoping to recover at least one witness who could provide detailed debriefing about exactly how completely their tactics had failed. The base commander's face remained professionally composed while authorizing the search operation, though his hands betrayed tension that no amount of training could completely suppress when contemplating explanations he would soon owe to Moscow about losses sustained without inflicting any damage on enemy forces. The second kill came within 90 seconds of the first. Another MiG pilot dying before his threat receiver even registered the missile launch that sealed his fate in a war that existed only in shadows and deniable engagements far from acknowledged battlefields. Lieutenant Marcus Webb maintained his scan discipline with the detachment that superior technology afforded, his radar painting targets at ranges where Soviet pilots still believed themselves safely beyond American reach. Each blip on his scope representing not just an aircraft, but the comprehensive failure of enemy intelligence to grasp how thoroughly the Eagle had changed the calculus of aerial combat. His weapon system chirped confirmation. of optimal firing parameters, while the MiG continued its patrol pattern in blissful ignorance, pilot probably discussing dinner plans or complaining about equipment maintenance over radio frequencies that American listening posts would analyze for tactical intelligence in the days ahead. The trigger squeeze required less pressure than signing his name. Sparrow missile dropping cleanly from the weapons bay before its rocket motor ignited in a column of white exhaust that carried mathematical certainty toward a target whose defensive systems would wake up far too late. Webb's wingman called the shot over tactical frequency with professional brevity that acknowledged another enemy removed. From the battle space, voice carrying neither triumph nor regret, but merely confirmation of weapons employment meeting expected results. The MiG exploded 30 miles distant, fireball visible only on infrared sensors that translated human tragedy into abstract thermal signatures, filed away in mission recorders. Soviet controllers heard only silence where their pilot's routine status check should have arrived, absence that would stretch into frantic radio calls, and eventually memorial services conducted without recovered remains. The third engagement followed the established pattern with variations that tactical debriefing would later identify as Soviet attempts to adapt doctrine. Mid-battle, desperate maneuvers that might have worked against previous generation American fighters, but proved comprehensively inadequate against the Eagle's technological superiority. Captain Jennifer Morrison tracked her target through a diving turn that the MiG pilot executed with genuine skill, hands probably moving with practiced confidence, while his threat receiver remained silent about the death approaching from beyond visual range. Her missile found him at the bottom of his defensive spiral, warhead detonation converting kinetic energy and explosive force into shrapnel that shredded control surfaces and hydraulic systems in the microsecond before the fuel tanks ignited. A parachute that emerged from the debris cloud deployed properly, but descended toward ocean waters that granted slim survival odds, even with functioning rescue coordination, which Soviet command no longer possessed, given how thoroughly the engagement had collapsed their operational planning. Morrison marked the kill without ceremony, already sweeping her radar arc for additional threats, while her element leader directed the formation toward egress routes that would keep them beyond effective range of any Soviet reinforcements, scrambling to contest airspace they had already lost. 3 down, no American losses, numbers that would justify procurement budgets and strategic assumptions, while fundamentally altering Soviet calculations about challenging Western air superiority. The fourth MiG died trying to run, pilot finally recognizing that engagement meant certain death against enemies he could neither see nor effectively target with weapon systems suddenly rendered obsolete by American engineering advances. His afterburners painted infrared signatures across the Eagle pilot's displays as he pushed his aircraft to maximum speed in a desperate sprint toward theoretical safety that existed only in outdated tactical manuals written before the F-15 had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. The Sparrow that caught him had been fired from a range that would have seemed impossible to Soviet military planners reviewing pre-mission briefings, their calculations about American capabilities proven catastrophically conservative by burning wreckage now falling toward cold waters. His last radio transmission consisted of a single word repeated 3 times, profanity that transcended language barriers in expressing the universal human response to recognizing death's approach without any remaining options for escape or resistance. The missile struck his port engine with precision that spoke to years of American research into guidance systems and proximity fuses, explosion propagating through the airframe faster than ejection sequences could complete their mechanical ballet, Soviet search and rescue would find nothing but debris slicks and oil sheens, marking where four pilots had believed themselves masters of their domain until American technology had demonstrated otherwise with brutal efficiency that Moscow's generals would struggle to explain to political leadership demanding accountability. Colonel Dmitry Volkov gripped the radio handset with knuckles gone white as chalk. His command post buried 3 stories beneath Libyan desert sand, suddenly feeling less like a fortress and more like a tomb, where Soviet ambitions went to suffocate under the weight of American technological superiority. Static crackled through. Speakers that should have carried routine status reports from his patrol flights. Silence expanding with each passing second into confirmation of losses that no amount of tactical doctrine could explain away to Moscow's unforgiving military apparatus. His deputy stood frozen beside the plotting table, where magnetic counters representing their fighters had been moved from active patrol positions to the dreaded casualty column. 4 men gone in the time it took to brew a pot of tea, while enemy aircraft operated with the casual impunity of house cats hunting sparrows. Volkov's orders came in clipped Russian phrases, stripped of the confident authority that had characterized his command. Style before American Eagles had turned his carefully planned air defense network into expensive fireworks falling toward the Mediterranean. Desperation bleeding through professional composure like ink through wet paper. He directed the remaining flights to collapse their patrol radius and descend to low altitude, where terrain might mask their radar signatures, tactics borrowed from outdated manuals written for a different war against different enemies, who hadn't possessed sensors capable of looking down through ground clutter to find targets hugging the earth. The radio operator's face reflected the fluorescent lighting with a pallor that matched his colonel's growing understanding. That Soviet equipment faced not a minor disadvantage, but a comprehensive obsolescence that would cost more lives if he continued feeding pilots into airspace. Dominated by technology, his intelligence briefings had dismissed as Western exaggeration. Volkov's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the encrypted telephone connecting him to theater. Command, knowing his career would likely end in the conversation ahead, but unwilling to sacrifice more men to prove what 4 burning wrecks had already demonstrated beyond any possibility of denial or face-saving reinterpretation. The command bunker's stale air grew thicker with cigarette smoke as Soviet officers clustered around communication. Equipment, their animated discussions in urgent Russian, creating a soundscape of institutional panic that no amount of ideological training could suppress when confronted with battlefield reality contradicting everything their doctrine promised. Major Yevgeny Sokolov argued for immediate reinforcement with additional squadrons, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had not yet accepted that numbers meant nothing against enemies who killed from beyond visual range with near-perfect efficiency. Each additional aircraft sent merely adding to the butcher's bill without changing the fundamental equation. Volkov cut him off mid-sentence with a gesture that brooked no argument, explaining in words chosen for their brutal clarity that sending more MiGs against F-15's equipped with look-down, shoot-down radar constituted not tactical boldness, but criminal stupidity that would see them all facing military tribunals for wasting state resources and Soviet lives. The younger officers fell silent, their faith in equipment and training crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide of American engineering that had quietly revolutionized aerial warfare, while Soviet designers remained trapped in incremental improvements to fundamentally outdated concepts. Volkov's orders came heavy with the weight of admission that retreat represented their only viable option, directing all remaining aircraft to disengage and return to base, while he prepared reports that would acknowledge what Moscow's pride would struggle to accept. The plotting table's remaining magnetic counters began moving toward friendly airspace in formations tight enough to provide mutual support against an enemy who had already proven such tactics inadequate. Soviet pilots flying home to debriefings that would force uncomfortable conversations about the widening technological gap between superpowers. Outside the bunker's reinforced walls, the desert night continued its indifferent rotation, while American fighters maintained their patrol stations with the relaxed confidence of predators who had thoroughly cowed their opposition, their radar screens showing Soviet formations withdrawing in patterns that tactical computers recognized as defeat, even when official communications would never use such politically unacceptable terminology. Webb checked his fuel state and confirmed weapons remaining, professional assessment, noting they had expended fewer missiles than anticipated because enemy pilots had recognized futility faster than intelligence predictions suggested. Soviet training apparently including enough battlefield pragmatism to understand when continuation meant suicide rather than heroism. His wingman remarked over the tactical frequency that Russian controllers sounded different now on the intercepted communications, voices carrying defeat's unmistakable timbre that transcended language barriers and encryption protocols. Human desperation readable even in radio procedures designed to mask emotional content. The Eagles turned toward their carrier rendezvous with mission recorders full of data that would fuel countless briefings and justify procurement decisions already made, but requiring battlefield validation that 4 confirmed kills had provided in abundance. Morrison's aircraft slipped into formation position with practiced ease, her thoughts already turning toward debrief sessions and paperwork, while below them, Soviet rescue. Helicopters began their grim searches for survivors who probably did not exist. The engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes from first missile launch to enemy withdrawal, brief violence that would echo through military planning offices for years to come as both sides absorbed lessons about technology's role in modern aerial combat and the brutal efficiency with which superior systems could dominate airspace. The debriefing room at Ogbah Ben Nafi Air Base smelled of burnt coffee and the acrid sweat of men whose certainty had been stripped away by 20 minutes of engagement against an enemy they had vastly underestimated, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across faces that reflected something between shell shock and professional humiliation. Captain Anatoly Krasnikov sat with his flight suit still damp from the nervous perspiration that accompanied his sprint back to friendly airspace, hands wrapped around a tea glass he couldn't bring himself to drink, while intelligence officers arranged tape recorders and notebooks with bureaucratic precision that felt obscene given the graves being prepared outside. His squadron commander paced before the assembled pilots with the restless energy of a caged animal, demanding explanations for losses that defied everything Soviet tactical doctrine promised about air combat dynamics and the supposed limitations of American equipment. 3 empty chairs stood in silent accusation where lost pilots should have sat, their absence speaking louder than any after-action report about the night's catastrophic encounter with technology that had rendered Soviet training obsolete in the span of heartbeats. Krasnikov's voice came hoarse when his turn arrived to describe the engagement, words stumbling over themselves as he tried explaining how his radar warning receiver had screamed threats from distances his instructors swore were impossible for airborne intercept systems operating against low-altitude targets. The other survivors nodded with the grim recognition of shared trauma, men who had witnessed their confidence evaporate like morning dew beneath the merciless sun of battlefield reality that contradicted every comfortable assumption. Major Sokolov interrupted Krasnikov's account with technical questions, delivered in tones that suggested the pilot must have misread his instruments or panicked under pressure, institutional denial seeking. Any explanation except the obvious conclusion that Soviet equipment faced comprehensive disadvantage against American sensor technology. Krasnikov's response came sharp, with anger barely controlled, explaining through clenched teeth that his instruments had functioned perfectly and his training had been exemplary, but neither mattered when enemies tracked you from ranges that left no time for countermeasures or evasive action. He described watching Victor's aircraft disappear in a fireball, before any visual contact with attackers occurred, the missile arriving like divine judgment from empty sky, while their own radars showed nothing but electronic noise and phantom returns. The other survivors corroborated his timeline with details that painted consistent pictures of one-sided slaughter rather than genuine combat. Soviet pilots dying without ever seeing the aircraft that killed them or having opportunities to employ their own weapons. Sokolov's face darkened as the weight of testimony accumulated into irrefutable evidence that Moscow's assurances about equipment parity had been either lies or dangerous self-deception that cost lives with bureaucratic efficiency. The squadron commander ceased his pacing and sank into a chair that suddenly seemed too large for his diminished authority, one hand rubbing temples, as if physical pressure might somehow reorganize facts into more palatable configurations. The intelligence officers exchanged glances, heavy with implications that transcended this single engagement, their questions shifting from tactical minutiae to broader assessments about American capabilities that would feed reports climbing Moscow's chain of command like poison working through a body. They pressed for details about the F-15's radar characteristics and missile performance, with intensity suggesting these debriefings served purposes beyond understanding one night's losses. Data collection for design bureaus tasked with closing gaps that suddenly appeared vast as Siberian tundra. Krasnikov provided what information his brief, terrifying encounter had yielded, describing radar warning tones he had never heard in training and missile flight profiles that suggested propulsion systems exceeding Soviet intelligence estimates. His fellow survivors added fragments that coalesced into mosaic pictures of American technology operating at sophistication levels that rendered current Soviet fighters dangerously outmatched in beyond visual range scenarios where modern air combat would be decided. The note-taking continued with mechanical persistence, even as everyone present understood that no amount of documentation would resurrect dead pilots or restore confidence shattered by the night's brutal education in technological disparity. Outside the debriefing room, maintenance crews worked on surviving aircraft with noticeably diminished enthusiasm. Ground personnel who recognized their careful preparations meant nothing when the equipment itself was fundamentally inadequate. Colonel Volkov entered near the session's end with shoulders carrying the visible weight of conversations. He had endured with theater command, his career's trajectory visibly altered by losses that could not be explained away through pilot error or bad luck. He dismissed the intelligence officers with curt efficiency and addressed his remaining pilots in Russian, stripped of propaganda's comfortable cushioning, acknowledging what everyone already knew. But military culture rarely permitted stating explicitly they had been sent to fight with inferior tools against adversaries whose technological advantage rendered courage and training insufficient for survival. His words carried the bitter honesty of a commander who valued his men's lives above his own advancement, promising he would ground all operations until they received equipment capable of contesting American air superiority or orders came from authority high enough to override his assessment. The pilots received this declaration with relief mixed with professional shame, grateful to be spared further suicide missions, yet humiliated by admission of comprehensive defeat that contradicted everything Soviet military mythology celebrated. Krasnikov felt exhaustion settle into his bones like winter cold, the adrenaline that had sustained him through combat and debriefing finally draining away to leave only awareness of how close he had come to occupying one of those empty chairs. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent mechanical song, while men processed lessons purchased with blood. The reverberations from that catastrophic engagement rippled through Soviet military-industrial corridors with seismic force that toppled careers and fundamentally restructured aircraft development priorities for the remainder of the Cold War's anxious decades. Within weeks of the detailed debriefing reports reaching Moscow, design bureaus received emergency directives accompanied by funding allocations that reflected Politburo-level panic about the technological chasm separating Soviet aviation from American capabilities that had transformed theoretical advantages into operational massacres. Engineers at Mikoyan and Sukhoi facilities found themselves working under intensified timelines that compressed normal development cycles into frantic sprints toward radar systems and fire control technologies that might restore some semblance of parity with the F-15's terrifying capabilities. The institutional arrogance that had characterized Soviet aviation doctrine evaporated like morning fog beneath the harsh sunlight of battlefield results that permitted no comfortable illusions about equipment superiority or ideological determinism. Senior officers who had dismissed intelligence reports about American sensor advances found their promotions stalled or reversed, their confident assertions now appearing as dangerous incompetence that cost lives and strategic advantage. Training regimens transformed to emphasize defensive tactics and terrain masking that acknowledged the uncomfortable reality of fighting from positions of technological inferiority against adversaries who owned the beyond visual range battle space completely. The psychological impact extended beyond technical specifications into the deeper confidence that sustained military institutions. Soviet pilots now approaching engagements with Americans carrying awareness that their equipment constituted fundamental handicaps rather than tools of assured victory. The MiG-29 and Su-27 programs received urgent acceleration, with specific mandates to incorporate radar systems and electronic warfare suites capable of detecting and countering threats at ranges matching or exceeding what American F-15's demonstrated during that pivotal engagement over neutral airspace. Test pilots found themselves pushed to operational limits during evaluation flights that sought desperately to validate improvements against simulated scenarios, replicating the nightmare conditions survivors described in their debriefings. Design compromises that might have been acceptable during peacetime development vanished beneath imperatives to field equipment capable of keeping Soviet pilots alive against adversaries whose technological edge had proven lethal with systematic efficiency. The financial costs spiraled into billions of rubles diverted from other military programs, leadership concluding that air superiority constituted non-negotiable requirements for maintaining superpower status, regardless of budgetary constraints. Intelligence operations intensified their focus on Western aviation technology, with resources reflecting desperate hunger for insights that might shortcut development timelines or reveal exploitable weaknesses in American systems. Factory workers assembling new aircraft variants understood through institutional osmosis that their products represented responses to humiliating defeats that contradicted decades of propaganda about Soviet technological supremacy. The quiet desperation permeating these efforts spoke volumes about how completely a single engagement had shattered comfortable assumptions. Historical analysts would later identify this period as the beginning of terminal decline for Soviet military confidence, the moment when institutional certainty about inevitable victory gave way to grinding awareness of systemic disadvantages that no amount of ideological commitment could overcome through force of will. The technological gap exposed by F-15 capabilities extended beyond aviation into broader questions about industrial capacity and innovation that highlighted fundamental weaknesses in centrally planned economies, competing against market-driven research and development. Younger officers absorbed lessons their superiors tried suppressing, understanding that courage and training meant nothing against adversaries who killed you before awareness of danger registered. on instruments calibrated for yesterday's threats. The symbolic weight of those losses resonated through military academies where instructors reluctantly updated curricula to reflect realities contradicting everything Soviet doctrine had promised about the correlation of forces. Diplomatic negotiations acquired different tones as American confidence in technological superiority translated into harder bargaining positions on arms control and regional conflicts. The propaganda machinery struggled to contextualize defeats that couldn't be hidden from personnel who lived through them, or families burying pilots whose deaths exposed the hollowness of triumphalist narratives. What began as tactical defeats metastasized into strategic doubts about sustainability of competition against adversaries whose innovation cycles consistently outpaced Soviet responses. The F-15's dominance thus became more than military statistics, transforming into psychological warfare that eroded Soviet confidence with each engagement, that demonstrated American technological advantages, compounding into insurmountable operational superiority. By the time Gorbachev acknowledged the unsustainable costs of military competition during the late 1980s, the trajectory toward Cold War conclusion was already written in the contrails of battles where Soviet pilots died without seeing their killers. The lessons purchased with blood over neutral airspace reverberated through history's final chapters for the Soviet Union, technological defeats presaging the comprehensive collapse that would come when systems built on comfortable lies confronted realities they could no longer deny or survive. Those empty chairs in debriefing rooms symbolized more than individual tragedies. They represented the beginning of an ending that technological disparity made inevitable despite all ideological assertions to the contrary. Could the Soviets have ever closed the gap if they had acted sooner? Or was the outcome already determined by fundamental differences in how each superpower approached innovation? Subscribe to explore more untold stories from the Cold War's most decisive technological battles.